Do you think staying silent makes you smart? Harlan Voss, do you really believe that a single phrase like "not verified" is enough to erase 17 calls for help? 6 soldiers pinned down in the desert, fire pouring down from above, radios reduced to broken breaths, while you sat in a cold room, hand on the control console, giving the order to ignore them. Don't pretend this was moral. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision about who gets to live. But only seconds later, in one very brief moment, everything veered off course. The machine guns suddenly fell silent. The RPGs went quiet. No order came from the command center. No helicopters. No official rescue. Just one man in the dark choosing to do what you didn't dare to do. That man wasn't your superior. He wasn't protected by the system. It was Elias Grant, a former SEAL sniper treated by society as disposable, living in hiding with PTSD, beaten, despised, a man who had been abandoned, in the same way you had just abandoned others. So if you were Elias, would you dare to act, knowing that doing the right thing meant destroying your own life? If this passage makes you uncomfortable, angry, or forces you to think, don't scroll past it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow stories that expose the rawest truths, and leave a comment below. Do you choose action or silence? The sandstorm had just receded, leaving behind a Middle Eastern border region stained red with earth and the lingering smell of oil smoke. The ground looked as if it had been clawed and scraped, strewn with sharp rock fragments, the wind still hissing low along the mountain pass. 6 members of the SEAL team were on their way out of a reconnaissance mission that had lasted longer than expected. They moved in a tight formation, hugging the rock wall to avoid exposure, each step placed carefully, measured by breath. The storm disrupted everything: poor visibility, intermittent communications, and that was when the ambush closed in. Machine gun fire erupted from the left hillside, clean and decisive, cutting straight through the rare remaining calm. Fire from the left hillside. The shout had barely ended before it was crushed by the next burst. Tracer rounds streaked overhead, slammed into rock and threw sparks, forcing the entire team flat against the ground. The leader signaled to disperse, his hand striking the ground twice. A motion already reflexive, they shifted formation, searched for cover, but the high ground had been taken. Every small movement was locked down by firing angles from above. A young soldier slipped while changing position, his magazine slipping from his hand, metal striking stone, with a sharp, cold sound, so clear that everyone felt their heart jump with it. The leader rolled over, grabbed the soldier's shoulder, his voice lowered close to the ear. Quiet. Don't let them hear you breathe. The soldier swallowed dryly, eyes wide, hands shaking as he tried to keep the rifle tight to his chest. Every sound now became a traitor. An RPG tore through the air from behind, exploding violently, the shockwave throwing up dust and sway rock fragments. The only exit behind them collapsed in red smoke, sealing the gap they had just relied on. The entire team was forced into a narrow rock pocket, a slick slope in front, rubble behind, both sides within firing range. The leader glanced, assessed distance, counted the blasts, then shook his head. They were locked in. The radio was switched on, his hand gripping the antenna tightly. His voice kept low and even. Alpha 6, sending SOS. Repeat, SOS. The call sign was transmitted correctly, and the pauses matched the procedure. The response was a long stretch of static, wind screaming through the microphone like an empty breath. He changed frequencies, tried again, then again, still only interference. Someone behind him asked softly, "Does anyone hear us?" The question dissolved into the sound of bullets striking rock. They pressed close to the ground, waiting for an opening, but the opening did not come. Fire continued to pour down, short, calculated bursts keeping them pinned. The leader signaled for the team sniper to find an angle, but the space was blocked by dust and overlapping fire. He understood that every passing minute was another option taken away. The radio came on again, his voice hoarser. Alpha 6 calling command, emergency. This time, he clearly heard his own breathing in the headset. One member of the team pulled closer and spoke quickly. "How much battery?" The leader glanced at the screen, the battery bar dropping slowly but steadily. He answered briefly, "Not much." The answer was enough for the whole team to understand. They had been through situations like this before, when communication became the thinnest thread connecting them to the outside world. Another man tilted his head, listening hard, then shook it. Just static. Gunfire paused for a beat, as if testing their reaction. The leader lifted his head slightly and signaled to wait. He whispered, "Hold position. Don't return fire blindly." Another arm tightened. Sweat, mixed with sand running down a neck. From the high ground, another short burst rang out, enough to remind them who controlled the rhythm of breathing on this battlefield. The radio spoke again, for the 10th time or more. Alpha 6, sending SOS. Repeat. His voice no longer tried to hide the tension, but the cadence held. Someone counted quickly in his head, then asked, "How many times now?" The leader answered briefly, 17. The number hung in the air, heavier than any explosion. It was proof that they had done everything by procedure, and also a confession that the procedure was not saving anyone at this moment. The young soldier from earlier took a deep breath, then whispered, "If we rush out." The sentence stopped when the leader shook his head, his gaze hard. "Wait. Just one chance." He glanced toward the man carrying reserve ammunition and signaled to conserve. Every round now had to have a purpose, and the only purpose was to survive long enough to be heard. Wind tore through the mountain pass, carrying fine dust into eyes and mouths. One man squinted, muttered a curse, then fell silent again. At this distance, every word could become coordinates. The radio continued to return static, steady, and indifferent. The leader shifted position, trying to find a cleaner signal, his finger pressing the transmit button one more time, then stopping, waiting. In the headset, the hiss of wind mixed with the pounding of his heart straight into his head. Gunfire came again, closer this time, shattered rock spraying against helmets. The leader snapped quietly. Closer in, they slid lower, shoulders touching, forming a compressed mass. Brief exchange looks were enough. No one spoke about the worst possibility, because saying it now would change nothing. The radio flickered, the screen trembling slightly. The leader saw the battery bar drop another notch. He tried calling once more. Voice kept low. Alpha 6, SOS. The transmitted sound felt thin like a thread. The reply was still static, stretching long enough that he felt as if he were hearing the desert breathe. Someone beside him murmured, "If command doesn't hear." The sentence was left unfinished because it did not need to be completed. Time passed in short beats, measured by the gaps between bursts of gunfire. The leader checked the formation again, counting heads with a very small nod. 6. That number was still intact, and it was the only thing he could hold on to now. He brought the radio closer, shielding the microphone from the wind, pressed transmit, and waited. The battery bar hit the final threshold, the screen light fading. The leader stared at it, as if his stare could keep it lit longer. Another explosion rang out, close enough that dust coated the helmet lens. The radio emitted one last stretch of static, then fell silent in broken pulses, the screen darkening as the sound of gunfire continued to close in. The Joint Command Center lay deep inside the base complex, completely separated from the desert, where gunfire was still echoing in short, measured beats. Here, there was no sand-laden wind, no smell of oil smoke, only uniform white lighting, a large screen covering an entire wall, and the constant hum of air conditioning, like an artificial heartbeat. The space was designed to keep people alert, rational, detached from the life and death sensations outside. But that night, a red signal on the screen shattered that familiar order. The SOS code blinked continuously, lighting up and fading according to the military's standard cycle. It did not stutter, did not distort, did not carry the usual signs of post-storm interference. It was steady, patient, like someone knocking on a door for a long time while still believing there was someone on the other side listening. The technicians seated at the control consoles recognized the signal within the first minutes. One leaned closer to the screen, quickly scanned the parameters, then turned to a colleague and lowered his voice. Standard code, no error. A young officer standing at the central table looked up. He was just over 30, his uniform still sharply pressed, his eyes not yet accustomed to ignoring what was obvious. He moved quickly toward the command desk, pointed at the blinking red display, his voice unable to hide the tension. "Sir, they are cut off from withdrawal." He spoke fast, knowing that every second passing out there carried its own cost. Colonel Harlan Voss stood with his back to the screen, looking at the regional map mounted on the opposite wall. The map was dense with lines, symbols, and layered annotations, representing a complex territory where every decision carried consequences beyond a single reconnaissance team. He did not turn immediately. When he spoke, his voice was even, low, and without emotion. "Not verified. After a storm, interference is normal." The response fell into the room like a pre-prepared statement. The young officer froze for a brief beat, then stepped half a pace forward. "But they are sending full standard code. The transmission cycle is stable." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing that several pairs of eyes around the room had shifted from the screen to him. No one interrupted him, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone there understood what was being said and what was being avoided. Voss turned around, his gaze passing briefly over the red screen before settling on the young officer. He did not raise his voice, nor did he need to. "I am responsible for this sector." His tone was flat like steel, neither rising nor falling. It was the voice of someone accustomed to ending discussions before they fully began. A silence opened up. No one challenged him directly. A younger technician looked down at his keyboard, fingers frozen mid-motion, as if waiting for another signal. The communications officer glanced briefly at the young officer, then back to the screen, continuing to log data. The hum of the air conditioning became more pronounced in the quiet, steady, and cold, filling every gap left by words. The young officer took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sir, if this is interference, we can verify it very quickly. If it isn't," he left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the rest. He did not need to mention casualties, because those numbers were always updated last. When everything was already over, Voss stepped closer to the control desk, placed a hand on its edge, and looked directly at the screen. The red light reflected in his eyes. "We do not open a channel without verification," he spoke more slowly, each word landing precisely, as if reciting a principle long memorized. "There are too many variables after a storm. Electromagnetic interference, signal reflection, spoofing." He paused briefly, then continued. "If we react incorrectly, the entire sector will be exposed." Another officer nearby spoke up, his voice low and probing. "Sir, that team is very deep." The statement did not directly challenge the order, but it was enough to remind everyone that this was not a signal easily ignored. Voss looked at the speaker, his gaze, not harsh, but firm enough to close off further debate. "Precisely because they are deep, we must be certain." He turned back to the screen and then signaled to the audio technician. The technician hesitated for a very brief moment. He glanced at the stream of numbers still running, listened to the faint static coming from the speaker. He understood that what he was about to do was not merely a technical adjustment. Finally, he raised his hand and lowered the volume. The static softened, then disappeared. The SOS code still blinked on the screen, but the room could no longer hear it. The young officer turned sharply, looking toward the audio console, then back at Voss. "Sir," he stopped, realizing that the next words would cross an invisible line. Voss did not look at him. He looked at the map, where supply routes were densely marked, where unpublished reports were stacked within memory. Someone else in the room spoke quietly, as if to fill the space. "We will monitor it." The sentence sounded like reassurance, though it was unclear to whom it was meant to reassure. Time passed in small increments, measured by the blinking of the red signal. Each time it lit up, it felt like a reminder that someone out there was still calling. Each time it dimmed, it felt like a warning that the window of opportunity was closing. No one in the room spoke further about the SEAL team. Conversations shifted to other hotspots, other routes, other reports requiring immediate attention. The young officer stood still for a moment, then returned to his station. He sat down, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen. He knew he had just witnessed a significant decision, and he also knew that it would not be mentioned in any official report, at least not yet. He opened a new file on his terminal, typed a few short lines, then stopped and deleted them. Some things were not meant to be recorded in ordinary ways. Voss received a brief call from another department. He responded with concise, directive sentences. After ending the call, he remained standing for a moment, as if weighing something. The light from the screen reflected off the insignia on his shoulder, making it look heavier than usual. Another technician, who had been tracking the signal from the beginning, asked softly, "Sir, if the signal continues..." He did not finish the sentence. Voss turned to him, his gaze cold but not impatient. "We have our orders." The reply was short enough to end the matter. The red signal on the screen blinked a few more times. Then, following an input from the control desk, it was minimized, shifted to another corner of the interface, where unverified alerts were grouped. Finally, it disappeared entirely. The screen wall returned to its familiar maps and data, as if the code had never existed. No one spoke when the red indicator vanished. The room continued to operate, steady and efficient. Only an unnamed sensation lingered in the air, thin and cold, like a door that had just been closed very slowly, but decisively. The village lay lower than the main road, tucked away among strips of cracked dry land and concrete walls patched together through many generations of conflict. By day, it lived on old habits, fixing motorbikes, repairing generators, patching radios, trading batteries, trading wires. By night, it sank quickly, as if someone had switched off a single shared power source for the entire area. Elias Grant had been here so long that no one clearly remembered when he first appeared. People only knew that he was there, opening his small workshop in the morning, closing it in the afternoon, then disappearing at night into the back room, where the dim glow of an oil lamp leaked out for a few minutes before going dark. Elias bent over an old civilian radio, one hand gripping the soldering iron tightly. Even though the tip had already cooled, his hand trembled lightly, evenly, like a habit that could not be shaken. It was not cold. Hot wind blew in from the doorway, carrying the smell of sand and metal. He inhaled deeply, switched hands, and reset the wire into the correct position. The shaking did not make him rush. It only made every movement slower by a single beat. A child stood outside the door, holding a small stone, studying it for a moment, before tossing it at the sheet metal beside the table. The sound rang out dry and sharp. "Look at him. His hand shakes like an old man about to die." The child laughed, turning to the others, waiting for a reaction. Elias did not look up. He held his position, adjusted the solder point, and blew lightly to cool it. The laughter outside lingered a few seconds longer, then faded, like a game already grown boring. A middle-aged man stopped by, set another radio on the table, his voice urgent. "Can you look at it? Yesterday, it still picked up a signal." Elias nodded slightly, pulled the radio toward him. "Weak battery," he said it briefly. The man sighed, dug into his pocket, and placed a few small coins down. "Fix it quickly for me." Elias began removing the casing, his fingers shaking evenly, familiarly, as if his body had learned long ago how to work alongside the tremor. At noon, 2 local police officers appeared. They did not enter the workshop right away, leaning against a pillar and looking around. One spoke loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. "This guy always looks at people like he's got a problem." The other laughed, stepped inside, and lightly kicked the table leg. Elias looked up, his gaze pausing for a beat. The look held no challenge, nor did it plead. It was simply there, straight and empty. "Don't look at us like that." A sudden shove knocked Elias off balance, sending him backward. His back hit the ground, dust rising. The radio fell, its cover popping loose. Elias lay still for 1 second, then braced himself and sat up. He brushed sand from his shirt, picked up the radio, and checked it quickly. No one in the workshop spoke. The officers looked around, found the familiar silence, then turned and left, laughing. "Next time, remember to keep your head lower." Elias stood up and set the radio back on the table. He said nothing. Words of response had once mattered to him. Now they were only noise. He returned to his work, tightening screws, adjusting wires, as if the fall had been just another part of the workday. On his left wrist, an old watch showed beneath his sleeve. The leather strap was worn, the glass lightly scratched. The minute hand lagged a few minutes behind real time. A small discrepancy, but enough for those familiar with it to notice. Elias looked at it for a moment, set his tools down, and turned the adjustment knob. The minute hand crept forward, landed in the correct position. He released it. A few seconds passed, then the hand slid back, returning to its old rhythm. Elias exhaled and pulled his sleeve down. He was used to this. The watch was like him, trying to keep up, then falling out of step again. Late afternoon, the workshop gradually emptied. Elias handed back a repaired radio, accepted payment, and nodded. A woman stood at the door, hesitated, then said, "You fix generators better than the others." Elias replied, "Old ones are easier." The sentence sounded like a technical observation, or perhaps something he was saying to himself. When the sun set, the village changed color. Long shadows stretched across cracked walls, and sounds thinned out. Elias locked the workshop door and stepped into the back room. The room was narrow, just enough space for a bed, a wooden table, and a few crates. On the table lay old components, wires, batteries, and several obsolete devices. He sat down, took off his shoes, rubbed his wrist for a moment, then stood, poured water into a kettle, and waited for it to boil. When the power cut, the room darkened quickly. Elias was used to the dark. He lit the oil lamp, yellow light spilling onto the walls, making the cracks stand out clearly. He ate a simple meal, cleaned up, then sat at the table and took out a radio he had just repaired but not yet delivered. He inserted the batteries and switched it on. Familiar static filled the air, steady and low. Elias turned the dial, searching for a signal, like a habit before sleep. Outside, the village sank into silence. A dog barked a few times in the distance, then stopped. Wind slipped through the door cracks, making the lamp flame tremble slightly. Elias tilted his head, listening, his hand still turning the dial. He was not searching for anything specific. He was only checking whether the radio was functioning properly. A strange sound cut through the static, short, broken, like a breath being held back. Elias stopped turning the dial. He leaned closer, adjusted very slightly. The sound repeated, a little clearer. A familiar sequence, a call sign he had heard hundreds of times in another life. He held his breath and brought the radio closer to his ear. Wind hissed through the microphone. Then a pause. Then again. Elias stood up. The chair behind him made a soft sound as it was pushed back. He turned the dial one more notch, precise enough that even his shaking hand had to stop to avoid throwing it off. The sound remained, fragile, but consistent. He closed his eyes for a second, as if confirming he was not mistaken. When he opened them, the oil lamplight reflected off the radio's glass, trembling with the flame. He changed frequency, tried again, then returned. The sound came back, clearer, an SOS code, transmitted short, steady, in proper rhythm. Elias felt his throat dry. He had heard this before, on other nights, in other places. Every time, it carried the same feeling, like someone pulling hard on a wire inside his chest. Elias raised his hand to his wrist, touching the watch beneath his sleeve. The hand was still slow. He did not adjust it. He set the radio down on the table and turned the volume up slightly. Static filled the room, then was cut by short, broken signals. He stood still, listening to each beat, each pause, as if reading an invisible map. Outside, the village was completely dark, the power fully out. No light existed except the small flame in his room. Elias bent down and pressed his ear close to the radio. In the thick darkness, a broken SOS sounded, thin and urgent, like a call compressed tightly between sand and wind. The sound filling the small room was unlike any interference Elias had heard in his many years repairing radios. It was not thin, not drifting, not shattered into formless noise. It had rhythm, short, steady, deliberately broken, as if the person on the other end were trying to hold their breath long enough to send each fragment of signal. Elias stood still in front of the table, eyes fixed on the dimly glowing radio. His hand lifted, then froze in midair, as if a single wrong movement might cause the sound to vanish. He held his breath, leaned down, and turned the frequency dial slowly and precisely, one notch at a time. With each adjustment, he paused for a beat to listen for a response. The static shifted slightly, a bit higher, then lower. He adjusted again, very little. When the sound emerged more clearly, Elias stopped completely. The familiar tremor in his left hand settled, as if his body understood that error was not permitted now. From the small speaker came hurried breathing, broken, mixed with the hiss of wind rushing across a microphone. The sound carried a familiar cadence, the rhythm of people pressed close to the ground, trying to stay silent while everything around them hunted for their position. Elias tilted his head, brought his ear closer. He did not need to guess. He had heard this long enough in his life to recognize it instantly. This was the battlefield, not a news broadcast, not an old recording, but the present, unfolding in real time. Elias raised his hand to the transmit button, his finger pausing for a very brief beat. He inhaled deeply, then spoke, his voice low and slow, carefully matching frequency and cadence. Alpha 6, this is, does anyone hear me? He did not give his name. It was unnecessary. In moments like this, names added no value. The response was a stretch of static. The wind continued to hiss, steady and cold. There was no human voice. Elias kept his hand on the transmit button for a few more seconds, then released it. He switched to another channel, tried again, then returned to the original frequency. The result was the same. Static, emptiness. This silence was not harmless. It carried weight. It was the silence created when a call failed to reach where it needed to go. Elias closed his eyes for 1 second. His jaw tightened enough for a dull ache to spread toward his temples. In that brief moment, old images flooded in, unordered, uninvited, faces fading under the red light inside a helicopter bay, familiar voices calling out to one another over radios, then disappearing. The times he had waited for a reply, counting beats, believing that just one more second would bring an answer, and then, nothing. He opened his eyes. The room was unchanged, small and quiet. The oil lamp flickered softly. The watch on his wrist still ran a few minutes slow, the minute hand moving to its own rhythm. Elias lowered his hand from the radio and leaned back against the table. He spoke very quietly, as if to himself. They've been abandoned. The words fell to the floor, unheard by anyone but him, yet they carried a cold certainty that required no further proof. Elias sat down and pulled the radio closer. He checked the batteries, the wiring, the antenna, and everything was intact. He knew the problem was not his equipment. He transmitted again, keeping his voice even. Alpha 6, if you can hear this, stay on channel. There was no response. The static continued, like an invisible wall standing between the two sides. Outside, the village remained submerged in darkness. No engines, no voices. The world seemed to shrink into this room, between one man and a radio. Elias looked into the radio's glass face and saw a faint reflection of himself. The face was older than the last time he had stood in the desert, but the eyes were not. They held the same way of looking, of judging distance and time, of recognizing danger before it fully revealed itself. He stood and walked to a wooden cabinet set against the wall. The cabinet was old, its paint peeling, rarely opened. Elias stopped in front of it, placed his hand on the door. In his mind surfaced other silences, times he had obeyed orders, waited, trusted that someone else would handle it. Each time, the result had been the same. A voice vanished, and a report was rewritten afterward. Elias turned back to the radio one more time. The signal was still there, weak but persistent, like a plea reaching from far away. He did not need further confirmation. The decision had formed the moment he recognized the code. He opened the cabinet. Inside, beneath a yellowed cloth, lay old military equipment, long removed from official systems, auxiliary transmitters, cables, spare batteries, objects from a time he had thought buried. Elias stood motionless before the open cabinet, the oil lamp casting light along the cold edges of metal. Behind him, the SOS signal continued to break through in short bursts, steady and urgent, like a heartbeat forced tight between sand and wind. Elias stood in front of the wooden table, the oil lamp casting light over devices that were old but so familiar that his body reacted before thought. He pulled the auxiliary frequency transmitter out of the cabinet, set it down, and wiped a thin layer of dust from the metal surface. This was a type of equipment long removed from official systems, slow, heavy, power-hungry, but with one advantage newer systems no longer had. It did not obey current control barriers. Elias inserted the batteries, tightened the connectors, and checked the cables one last time. His hands trembled, but every movement was precise, each action falling into a position deeply etched into muscle memory. He flipped the switch. A low hum sounded, deep and steady, spreading through the small room like a bass rhythm. Elias tilted his head, listened, and adjusted the fine-tuning knob to keep the frequency stable. He knew he did not have much time. With every second that passed, the SEAL team out there was still pressed to the ground, still held under fire. He pulled the radio closer, listened again to the SOS signal, confirmed the signal direction, then positioned the transmitter precisely, where the outgoing signal would overlap with residual reflection bands left behind by the storm. On the battlefield, a searchlight abruptly swept away from the mountain pass. The shift was very slight, but enough to create a fragile opening. The next rounds no longer tracked the previous position. Tracer fire streaked into open space, striking rock and sand. The SEAL commander sensed the change before he had time to analyze it. He signaled silence, then leaned to observe. A soldier edged closer and whispered, "They're firing off." Elias adjusted the output level, sweat beginning to soak through his shirt. The low hum rose slightly, then stabilized. He kept his eyes on the gauge, never looking away for even a beat. Too great a change would make the interference obvious. Too weak would have no effect. He remembered clearly past trials like this, where small errors could expose an entire team. He kept his breathing steady, slow, forcing his body to follow. Out there, the SEAL commander leaned close to his headset and whispered over the internal channel, "Hold formation, prepare to crawl." Another voice answered, low and tense. The light shifted. The commander narrowed his eyes, watching the direction the beam had just left. "Move on my signal." He waited one more beat, enough to be sure the shift was not a decoy. Elias increased the amplitude very slightly, just enough to push another reflection layer into the monitored band. Above, the ambush element adjusted fire according to new data. Rounds shifted lanes, fired into space where they believed the target was moving. The bullets tore through the air and shattered on rock, leaving meaningless sparks. The pass where the SEAL team lay pressed became quieter for a few precious seconds. "What the hell just happened?" the SEAL commander whispered, keeping his voice low. No one answered. They did not need explanations now. They needed to use the gap. He raised 2 fingers, then closed them into a fist. The formation began to crawl, one by one, pressed flat, moving along a pre-marked route. Stones rolled softly under hands. Dust clung to faces, but no one stopped. Elias felt the rhythm change through the headset. The SEAL team's rapid breathing shifted into a steadier cadence. He held the output constant, eyes fixed on the gauge. Each time the needle trembled, he made a tiny correction, enough to keep interference within acceptable bounds. Sweat ran down his spine. His hands were wet, and the tremor was more pronounced. He clenched his jaw and told himself, "Hold it." The words did not need to be spoken. They were meant for him alone. On the rock face, the The SEAL team rolled out of the pass, sliding down a slanted slope, using darkness and terrain. One man slipped slightly, struck a rock, but caught himself. The commander signaled halt, then continued. Above, fire still tracked false coordinates, following positions guided by distorted data. Searchlights swept empty ground. Missing bodies pressed flat below. Elias heard wind hiss in the headset, mixed with background interference. He knew the distortion was working, and also knew it would not last long. Any sufficiently advanced system would soon detect the anomaly. He lowered output 1 beat, then raised it again, creating a sense of natural fluctuation. This was the most dangerous phase, where patience and instinct decided everything. At a local control station, a small screen flickered. A young technician frowned, looking at a signal trace that had just appeared. It was unclear, but enough to raise suspicion. He zoomed in, checked again, then turned to the person beside him. Something's off. The other glanced over and nodded. Monitor it. Elias did not know that, but he felt the change through slower feedback on the gauge. He held steady, did not force more. He knew when to stop. In the headset, the SEAL commander whispered, "We're clear." The short sentence was enough for Elias to release a long breath. He did not celebrate. He shifted to stabilization mode, preparing to cut. The SEAL team continued to withdraw, one by one, until the distance was safe. The commander signaled halt and quickly checked the formation. 6 men, intact. He nodded and said quietly, "Move." No one asked questions. They knew an invisible hand had opened a door for a few seconds, and that door was closing fast. Elias gradually reduced power, one small step at a time. The low hum dropped, then stabilized at baseline. He held it for a few seconds, then prepared to shut down completely. At that moment, a counter signal flashed on a secondary display he had temporarily wired into the transmitter. It was sharp, brief, and not part of the band he was using. Elias narrowed his eyes. They had seen it. His hand moved toward the switch, weighing the choice in a split second. If he cut immediately, the source would stand out more clearly in retrospective analysis. If he held longer, the risk of localization increased. He chose the middle path, sharply reduced amplitude, shifted cadence, then cut. The hum stopped completely. The room became so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Elias leaned back against the table and wiped sweat from his forehead. He did not look toward the door. He knew this was not over. He packed up quickly, unplugged the transmitter, returned it to the cabinet, and covered it with a cloth. The radio still emitted background static, but the SOS signal faded, then vanished entirely. He stood still for 1 beat, listening. No more rapid breathing, no more calls. Another sound followed, not from the radio. A violent pounding on the door behind him, hard and urgent, enough to shake the wooden frame. Elias turned, his eyes settling on the door, shuddering with each blow. A rough voice called out, words unnecessary to understand. He remained still, one hand resting on the edge of the table. As the pounding continued, relentless, like a new count beginning, the door burst open with a hard shoulder strike, wood slamming into the wall with a dry crack. Flashlight beams swept the room and stopped on the table, still carrying the smell of hot metal. Elias turned halfway before he was shoved forward, his back hitting the concrete floor. One hand pinned his shoulder, another ripped the radio off the table. Plastic shattered, components flew, the sound of breaking filling the small room like an exclamation mark that needed no explanation. Elias was forced to face down on the ground. Sand and dust stuck to his lips and teeth. He heard the breathing of the man standing on his back, heavy and fast. "You were transmitting illegally." The question was dropped like a hook. The punch followed immediately, without waiting for an answer. His head snapped to the side. His ear rang. The flashlight beam smeared into a long streak. Elias did not cry out. He clenched his jaw and kept his breathing low, as he had learned long ago. Someone bent down, searched his jacket, and pulled out the old watch. "This is worth something too." A dry laugh followed. Elias shifted, tried to reach out, but the pressure increased. "Stay still." The voice pressed down. He stayed still. Silence now was reflex, the only way to keep what remained from breaking further. They hauled him up and dragged him outside. Night had fallen, the village dark, only vehicle lights flashing. Elias stumbled forward, his head slightly bowed. He recognized the familiar smell of oil smoke, the same smell he had breathed for years in other places. Before the vehicle door slammed shut, he caught a brief glimpse of his workshop. The door was still open, the oil lamp flickering, like an eye that had not yet closed. The temporary holding post sat at the edge of the village, with rough concrete walls, peeling paint. Elias was shoved inside. The iron door slammed shut, metal striking metal with a hollow sound. The cell was narrow, the ceiling low, a bare bulb hanging loose. The light flickered in rhythm with a weak generator, bright then dim. like an unsteady heartbeat. Elias stood for a moment to regain his balance, then sat on the wooden bench, set against the wall. He raised a hand to his mouth and tasted salt. Blood leaked from the corner of his lip, soaking into the skin. Elias wiped it gently with his sleeve, the movement slow and careful. He removed the watch from his wrist and placed it in his palm. A thin streak of blood marked the glass. He rubbed it away with his fingertip, repeating until the glass was clear again. The minute hand was still slow, still moving to its own rhythm. Elias set the watch down on the bench and straightened it slightly. Outside the cell, voices drifted in. Broken. We found the transmitter. Looks like it came from the workshop. Question him more. Elias closed his eyes for a second and exhaled slowly. He knew the questions coming would circle things he had no intention of explaining. Old equipment, obsolete frequencies, and reasons difficult to prove. He was used to this. Some actions did not require justification to exist, and systems that did not need to hear justification to function. The door opened. A man stepped in, notebook in hand, voice even. Name. Elias answered. Occupation. Repair work. The man wrote. Looked up. What signal did you transmit tonight? Elias met his gaze and replied slowly. Broken radio. The answer was simple. Partly true. The man smirked, closed the notebook. We'll check. He turned and left, the flickering light filling the room again. Time passed in beats of light. On, off, on. Elias sat still, his back against the wall, eyes following the strip of light on the floor. He heard wind outside, the generator coughing. In the pause between flickers, another sound slipped in. Distant. Gunfire. Scattered, brief, then gradually thinning. Elias tilted his head and listened. The firing was no longer dense. The direction was farther away. He understood what that meant. Outside, the SEAL team was withdrawing, not through a report, but through the familiar sense of someone who had lived through too many nights like this. Elias exhaled, his shoulders lowering slightly. He did not smile. He allowed himself only a very small release. That was the only reward he gave himself. The door opened again. A young guard stood at the threshold, looked in, then down the corridor. He lowered his voice. Stay put if you want to live. The words carried no dramatic threat. They sounded like advice drawn from experience. Elias nodded once. The guard lingered for a beat, as if wanting to say more, then turned away. The light flickered again. Darkness flowed in, then receded. Elias picked up the watch and put it back on. He adjusted his sleeve so the worn leather strap lay flat. He sat upright, placed both hands on his thighs, and kept his back against the wall. Pain in his jaw reminded him that the body was still here, still enduring. He counted his breaths, steady and low, as when lying in wait in places without wooden benches or concrete walls. Outside the corridor, footsteps grew sparse. A shift change. Voices softened. The smell of tobacco drifted through the crack in the door. Elias opened his eyes and stared into the darkness ahead. He thought of the transmitter stored away again, of how he had reduced power on the final beat, of the counter signal flashing. He knew they would trace it, sooner or later, depending on who sat behind the screens. He also knew there were times when systems lost patience before people did. Night deepened. The generator faltered for a beat, then resumed, the light flickering longer. Elias listened to the subtle change. He heard metal clink softly at the end of the corridor, keys touching. A pause followed, long enough to tell habit from anomaly. Then everything settled. Voices disappeared. Footsteps moved away. Only wind and the generator's rough breathing remained. Elias stood and walked slowly to the door. He did not touch the bars. He stood still and listened. Another beat passed. No voices, no boots. Somewhere in the village, a shift had been left unattended. A small exchange had taken place, enough for someone to turn away at the right moment. Elias did not know the details, but he felt the gap like an unnatural current of air. He stepped back half a pace, eyes fixed on the door's outline. The cell door trembled softly, very lightly, as if touched from the outside. Elias held his position, his heartbeat slow. A gap appeared, thin and dark. Corridor light spilled in, as a narrow strip across the floor. Elias looked at that strip of light, neither stepping forward nor back. He stood there in the darkness as the door opened another fraction, just enough for the dark to flow in like an unspoken invitation. The cell door opened very slowly, just enough for the darkness outside to spill into a thin strip across the concrete floor. Elias stood still, just beyond the threshold, not stepping out right away. He paused for one beat and tilted his head to listen. There were no footsteps, no voices, only distant wind and the generator's rhythm, now noticeably weaker. The gap did not last long, but it was real enough for him to decide. Elias stepped out and closed the door again, gently enough that the metal did not have time to react. He moved along the outer wall of the temporary post, keeping his back against the rough concrete. Night in the village was dense, scattered light from a few houses not yet fully dark, not enough to clearly outline a human shape. Elias did not run. He walked steadily, placing his feet low, keeping his breathing short and deep. Running pushed the heart rate past the threshold of control, and crossing that threshold was where mistakes began. He had learned that long ago. In nights where the smallest error was enough to trade places between the living and the dead, the repair shop lay silent. Elias opened the door, slipped inside, and closed it behind him. He did not turn on the light. His hands moved by memory, finding the familiar corner. The old rifle was wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden behind a crate of components. Elias unwrapped it and felt the cold metal under his hands. He pulled the bolt, checked the magazine. Exactly 2 clean rounds left. No more, no less. Elias looked at the 2 rounds for one more beat, then nodded very slightly, as if confirming with himself. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and adjusted the strap to fit. The old watch on his wrist tapped against the stock, making a very small sound. Elias stopped and waited for that sound to dissolve into silence. The minute hand was still a few minutes slow, but he did not adjust it. At this moment, real time no longer mattered. What mattered was the rhythm he was holding. Elias left the village by a back path, where the ground was uneven and rarely used. Wind blew down from the hillside, carrying the smell of sand and old smoke. He crawled up the slope, chest pressed to the ground, dragging the rifle forward in short beats. Rocks scraped against his clothes and skin, but he did not stop. He counted the wind's rhythm, not in numbers, but by the sensation on his neck and face. Strong for 1 beat, weak for 1 beat, then still. He moved when the wind was strong and stopped when it faded, letting his shadow blend into the natural movement of the night. As he neared the high point, Elias lowered himself even more. He crawled a little farther, searching for a position with a wide enough view while still maintaining cover. He set the rifle down, adjusted the bipod, then lay on his side, cheek pressed to the stock. Before looking through the scope, he listened. Sound drifted up from the ravine in fragments, rounds striking rock, wind whistling through narrow gaps. The firing rhythm was uneven, but close enough to keep the team binned to the ground. Elias brought his eye to the scope. The frame was tight, targets overlapped. A gunman stood behind, weapon held low. In front of him, a shorter figure, shoulders tense, pressed close to the rock. The distance between them was only a few steps. Elias recognized the front figure's posture. Seal. The firing angle was too narrow. A single beat off, and the round would pass exactly where it must not. Elias lowered the rifle. He whispered very softly, almost without sound. Not yet. The words were not meant for anyone else. They were a reminder, an order to himself. He set the rifle again, right hand on the trigger, left hand supporting the barrel, but did not tighten. He waited. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds. His hands began to tire, not from weight, but from holding at the boundary between motion and stillness. His heart wanted to speed up. The cell door opened very slowly, just enough for the darkness outside to spill into a thin strip across the concrete floor. Elias stood still, just beyond the threshold, not stepping out right away. He paused for 1 beat and tilted his head to listen. There were no footsteps, no voices, only distant wind and the generator's rhythm, now noticeably weaker. The gap did not last long, but it was real enough for him to decide. Elias stepped out and closed the door again, gently enough that the metal did not have time to react. He moved along the outer wall of the temporary post, keeping his back against the rough concrete. Night in the village was dense, scattered light from a few houses not yet fully dark, not enough to clearly outline a human shape. Elias did not run. He walked steadily, placing his feet low, keeping his breathing short and deep. Running pushed the heart rate past the threshold of control, and crossing that threshold was where mistakes began. He had learned that long ago. In nights where the smallest error was enough to trade places between the living and the dead, the repair shop lay silent. Elias opened the door, slipped inside, and closed it behind him. He did not turn on the light. His hands moved by memory, finding the familiar corner. The old rifle was wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden behind a crate of components. Elias unwrapped it and felt the cold metal under his hands. He pulled the bolt, checked the magazine. Exactly 2 clean rounds left. No more, no less. Elias looked at the 2 rounds for 1 more beat, then nodded very slightly, as if confirming with himself. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and adjusted the strap to fit. The old watch on his wrist tapped against the stock, making a very small sound. Elias stopped and waited for that sound to dissolve into silence. The minute hand was still a few minutes slow, but he did not adjust it. At this moment, real time no longer mattered. What mattered was the rhythm he was holding. Elias left the village by a back path, where the ground was uneven and rarely used. Wind blew down from the hillside, carrying the smell of sand and old smoke. He crawled up the slope, chest pressed to the ground, dragging the rifle forward in short beats. Rocks scraped against his clothes and skin, but he did not stop. He counted the wind's rhythm, not in numbers, but by the sensation on his neck and face. Strong for one beat, weak for one beat, then still. The 2 shots had left the barrel, but Elias did not leave his position. He kept the sight picture, his cheek still pressed to the stock, his eye still fixed through the scope. He did not look at where the targets had fallen. Looking at results is a reflex that makes people want to end things early. For Elias, the most dangerous thing now was not what had already happened, but what had not yet happened. Wind crossed the hillside, carrying fine sand that brushed lightly against the scope glass. Elias, let it be. He listened, his hearing tightened, separating layers of sound from one another. Wind, stone, breath, distant metal. Everything mattered more than sight. A blind return shot, fired on reflex, could come from any direction in the next few seconds. On the radio, the first voice from the SEAL team came through, low and broken, as if forced out of the chest. It's quiet now. Elias recognized the breathing pattern in that sentence, slower, more even. That was the first sign that the fire had truly stopped. But a sign was not the same as safety. Another voice cut in, whispering fast but firm, "Don't stand up. Wait longer." It was not an official command. It was an experience speaking. Elias understood perfectly. He had heard words like that on other nights, in other places, where people died because they believed silence meant the end. He kept the scope steady, sweeping very slowly along a familiar diagonal. No abnormal movement, no new muzzle flash. The firing rhythm stayed dead. Elias counted internally, not by seconds, but by heartbeats. Each beat that passed without response was a good signal, but not enough. At the foot of the hill, a flashlight came on later than Elias had expected. A single beam, sweeping sideways, then stopping. Someone had begun to doubt. That doubt came late, meaning they were still processing the shock. But it also meant the safety window was closing. Elias did not leave the scope. He held the position for one longer beat. If a return shot came, it would come in this span. This was when survivors tried to regain control by instinct, firing toward where they believed the danger had originated. Elias had seen too many people die by leaving one beat too early. The flashlight below swept again, closer. Elias felt tension spread along his spine. He still did not move. When the beam drifted away, he worked the bolt, very slowly, very cleanly. He caught the casings in his hand, did not let metal touch stone. The 2 shells slid into his jacket pocket, settled, leaving no trace. On the radio, another voice came through. "Deeper, stay low, follow me." Elias knew they were pulling out. The breathing rhythm across the team was no longer sharp. It shifted into a movement cadence, steady, heavy, but alive. Elias released a very small breath, just enough to loosen the pressure in his chest. He still did not leave the high point. Elias folded the bipod, but did not stand. He slid backward, keeping his body pressed to the ground, following the exact path he had used to climb up. The ground beneath his hands changed from hard stone to loose sand. Each slide had to pause for one beat, letting the heart settle, keeping breath from breaking the dark. A flashlight swept the hillside, lower than the position he had just left. Elias froze, flattened himself, let sand coat his back. The beam passed slowly, probing. A distant voice carried, words indistinct. Elias waited. When the light moved on, he continued, sliding lower. The loose sand slowed movement. Elias accepted it. Faster would leave tracks, and tracks would lead others straight up the path he had taken. He chose a longer route, fewer marks. Each time his heart struck harder by one beat, he stopped, lowered his shoulders, and regulated his breathing until the tremor faded. At the base of the hill, Elias stopped completely. He sat low, leaning against a rock, listening again to the space around him. The wind shifted direction. The smell of gun smoke thinned. On the radio, the SEAL team's whispers grew faint, then vanished. They were far enough. Elias's task here was finished, but the danger to him was not. He removed the radio from his shoulder and lowered the volume to baseline. Elias stood, kept himself low, and moved toward the village along a different route. Night still covered him, but he did not trust darkness. Darkness only helps for a while. After that, it turns quickly. When he was a few hundred meters from the village, Elias stopped again. He heard a sound that was not wind, not scattered footsteps. It was a radio coming on, not his. Familiar static carried from somewhere inside the village. Elias stood still. The sound grew clearer. Then a voice cut through the interference, broken but loud enough to carry. Elias Grant. The name was spoken clearly, exposed, needing no explanation. It was not asked. It was read out as confirmation. Elias closed his eyes for a brief beat, then opened them. He did not turn around. He had known this moment would come. Sooner or later, he adjusted the rifle strap, stayed low, and blended into the deeper shadow behind broken walls. In the village, the confiscated radio kept transmitting, repeating his name through the static, like a sign that the dark had just called the right person. Morning arrived slowly in the Joint Command Center. The fluorescent lights kept the same cold tone as during the night, reflecting off rows of screens still open to battlefield data. The new shift came in by routine. Hot coffee set down on desks. A few brief greetings exchanged. No one knew that in just a few minutes, the room's rhythm would change, and what had been forced into silence all night would surface most brutally. A technician sat at the system log console, reviewing the data left behind overnight. He planned to finish a quick report and move on. But when he scrolled deeper into the rescue channel timeline, his eyes stopped. He zoomed in, rewound, then did it again. His face drained of color. He leaned toward the colleague beside him, his voice dropping. Someone muted the SOS, using command authority. The words were not spoken loudly, but they spread fast. A young officer nearby turned, stepped closer, and ordered the logs reopened. The technician complied, his hands slightly shaking. The data appeared clearly. Timestamps lined up clean and precise. 17 distress signals sent. 17 times, the system received a full standard code, and 17 times, the audio was cut at the highest level. The young officer swallowed and asked for playback. The recording filled the room. Static, then a rushed voice, then silence. The next clip, then another. Each ended the same way. 17 calls, he said, his voice going rough. 17 pushed into silence. Another officer asked, very slowly, as if afraid the question itself might collapse the room. Who signed the order? No one answered immediately. The technician pulled up another data layer, confirming access credentials. A name appeared, clear and unmistakable. Harlan Voss. The air thickened. Several glances flicked toward the far end of the table, where Colonel Voss was standing, reviewing another report. He felt the shift before hearing his name. Voss turned, his eyes passing over the faces looking at him, then stopping on the main screen. The young officer steadied his voice, though the tension showed. Sir, who has the authority to mute that SOS channel? Voss looked straight at the screen and did not rush his reply. When he spoke, his voice was flat, familiar. I followed the verification protocol. The answer landed, but it did not have the effect Voss expected. A more senior officer stepped forward half a pace, his voice low and deliberate. What protocol allows muting an SOS? The question was not argumentative. It was a clean cut, with no room for evasion. No one backed Voss up. No one spoke for him. Voss held silence. For a long beat, he knew every word now would be examined. He chose the familiar line and repeated it. After the storm, electromagnetic interference was severe. We needed verification to avoid a misdeployment. A few people nodded by professional reflex, but their eyes were no longer with him. The data on the screen was too clear. Full standard code, stable transmission, not interference. Another officer requested a temporary lock on access privileges. The order went out immediately, as if it had been waiting. Voss's access badge was partially restricted, and several screens in front of him switched to read-only. Voss saw it. He did not protest, but the hand resting on the table tightened. You don't understand what you're doing, Voss said, his voice lower now, edged with urgency. He looked around, searching for a face that might still align with him. There was none. The people standing there were no longer looking at a commanding officer. They were looking at a decision and its consequences. No one responded. The room fell into a heavy silence. The 17 signals, now pulled back into the open, sat like evidence that could not be erased. One officer made quick notes, preparing an internal investigation report. Another contacted legal. Procedure began to move, cold and precise, the same way the system had coldly and precisely muted the cries for help. Voss stood still. He stared at the blank screen in front of him, where the red signal had once flashed and disappeared. He remembered that moment clearly. When he said not verified, he believed he was protecting position, protecting the chain of command, protecting reports that had already been edited. He did not think of the people lying in the sand, or he did think, and chose to push it aside. An alarm sounded, cutting through the spreading tension. This sound was different, sharper, and longer. A corner screen lit up, displaying new data. A humanitarian convoy was ambushed on the southern route. 3 hostages taken. Updates streamed rapidly, line after line. The duty officer read aloud, his voice quickening. Convoy split. 3 personnel are missing. Hostage situation confirmed. A second later, the hostages' names appeared. When the final name came up, the room seemed to freeze. Anna Voss. Voss stared at the screen. His face went visibly pale. His throat tightened, as if the air had been pulled from the room. The voices around him faded. He did not hear the next orders, did not hear the coordination requests. In his mind, the 17 signals just unearthed kept echoing, layered over his daughter's name. The alarm continued to sound, a reminder that the battlefield had not eased. But for Voss, everything had changed. He stood there in the command center as a delayed truth crashed down, that some decisions made in silence return with the loudest scream, striking exactly where one is least prepared. Midday reached the village with a washed-out light, spread evenly across tin roofs and patched concrete walls. Elias's repair shop opened as it did every day. He sat at the familiar wooden table, dismantling a civilian radio, laying the components out in an order only he remembered. His hands still trembled lightly, steadily, enough for an outsider to notice, but never enough to make him place a screw wrong. In his mind, the night before was still there, the waiting beats, the searchlight sweeping close, and the name that had surfaced through the static. He kept all of it behind him, letting the new day pass, like any other. Footsteps stopped at the doorway, not rushed. Someone stood there for a beat, long enough to observe. Elias did not look up. He heard the soft brush of fabric, the faint sound of metal. A man's voice spoke, kept just polite enough. "Are you Elias Grant?" The question was posed more like a final confirmation than an inquiry. Elias set the soldering iron down, without lifting his eyes. "I only repair radios." The reply was short, true to what he chose to keep for himself. The person outside did not respond immediately. A small gap formed, where the light at the doorway reached the tabletop and stopped there. The man stepped inside, followed by another. They stood slightly to one side, careful not to block the light. One of them placed a recording device on the table, very carefully, as if afraid to disturb the air. The play button was pressed. From the small speaker came static, then a distant breath, broken, uneven. The sound did not need explanation. Elias tilted his head and listened, just slightly. His hand moved without thought to the off-time watch on his wrist, his thumb sliding across the scratched glass. He listened long enough to distinguish wind direction inside the sound, long enough to recognize how the breathing was compressed between pauses. This was a weak signal, masked by terrain and background interference, impossible to localize by ordinary means. Elias knew that from the first beat. He said nothing. He waited for another stretch, until the underlying machine noise became clearer. "We need a bearing," the nearer man said, his voice low. "As soon as possible." Elias nodded very slightly, but still did not touch the device. He let the sound run a bit longer, then turned it off himself. The room returned to the small fan's hum and the old generator rhythm behind it. "Who is the hostage?" The question came from Elias, short, without emotion. It sounded more like a technical step than a reaction. The 2 men exchanged a very brief glance. Then the one who had placed the recorder answered clearly, without avoidance. "Anna Voss." Silence. Elias did not speak, did not move. The room held its shape. The light froze on the tabletop, and the background hum stayed even. In his chest, his breathing dropped another notch. An old memory surfaced, without clear images, only the familiar sensation of a name tied to a chain of decisions. He had heard too many names in nights when radios went silent. Some names passed through his life and vanished, leaving gaps that never fully closed. This name carried a different line, straighter, sharper. Elias looked at the watch. The minute hand was still slow. He left it alone. Real time was running somewhere else, in decisions being made very fast. Here, in the workshop, he held a pause long enough to steady his own rhythm. The men across from him did not press. They understood the value of this silence. "There's more audio," one of them said, very softly, as if afraid to break something. Elias reached out. He pulled the recorder closer and played it again. Static, then the breath, then a distant sound of metal touching ground. Elias tilted his head further, bringing his ear closer. He did not need more time to know the direction, but he needed one more beat to be sure the next decision was his. "We can't narrow it," the man behind said. "Broken terrain, reflected signal." Elias nodded. "It can be read," he replied. The answer came late, but firm. He stood and walked to the wooden cabinet against the wall. His hand rested on the door and paused for a beat. In his mind, the 17 signals being uncovered somewhere far away, overlapped with the breathing on the recorder. He did not connect them with words. He let them exist side by side. Elias opened the cabinet. Inside were old devices, neatly arranged, as if they had never been moved. He took out a direction-finding receiver and set it on the table. The two SEALs stepped back half a pace to give him space. Elias adjusted quickly, connected cables, and powered it up. A steady background hum appeared. He placed the recorder beside it, connected it, and made a very small adjustment. He listened. This time, he was not listening only to the breathing. He listened to how the sound struck the terrain, how it thinned and thickened by direction. He rotated the receiver, stopped at one angle, then another. Each stop he counted internally, not in seconds, but by feel. The bearing emerged gradually, not like an arrow, but like a narrow band. Elias marked it quickly with a pencil on a prepared sheet of paper. North, northwest, he said. Farther than you think. The man nearest nodded and wrote it down. Distance. Elias frowned, listened to another stretch, then answered, not fixed. They're moving. The words tightened the air. The man followed up. How long before it's gone, Elias? Did not answer immediately. He listened again, then said, when they shut the transmitter. That was enough. Another silence fell. Elias packed the equipment away, fast and clean. He returned the receiver to the cabinet and closed the door. His hand lingered on the handle. In his mind, an old night rose, a familiar voice calling over the radio, then cutting off. He had waited then. He had believed someone else would handle it. The weight of that belief had stayed with him a long time. Elias turned back to the table and looked at the two SEALs. I'm going with you, he said, not raised. No explanation. The nearer one looked at him for a beat, then nodded. We'll get ready. Elias bent down, opened a drawer, and took out the rifle he knew well. He checked it quickly. Without a display, he adjusted his watch strap and his sleeve. At that moment, sharp braking sounded outside. The noise was bright and abrupt, cutting through the workshop's rhythm. Elias stayed still, his hand on the rifle stock. Both SEALs turned their heads. A car door slammed, and hurried footsteps followed. Elias lifted his gaze toward the doorway. The light outside shifted. The pause that had been carefully held in the room stretched and warped, as a line pulled tight to its limit. Elias did not speak. He took half a step toward the door, keeping low. In his mind, the bearing he had just read was still fresh. Outside, another rhythm was arriving fast. The abandoned building stood apart from the main road, lower than the surrounding ground like a forgotten pit. By day, it was only a mass of cracked concrete. By night, it became something else. A place that held sound for a long time and swallowed light very quickly. Elias stopped at the edge of the darkness, making one last observation before signaling the reconnaissance team to close in. He did not look at the whole. He looked at individual details, the direction of wind slipping through wall gaps, the metallic smell in the air, the way footsteps echoed when someone behind him accidentally put down a foot too heavily. Elias moved first. His posture was lower than usual. Shoulders dropped to avoid forming a clear outline. The team behind kept exact spacing, close enough to see hand signals, far enough not to step into one another's shadow. Each person carried a personal rhythm, but Elias pulled them into a single pace, slower than instinct, faster than hesitation. At the side entrance, he stopped and tilted his head to listen. One beat, then another. No voices, only the faint hum of electricity somewhere inside. Elias turned halfway, leaned close to the man behind him, and whispered, "Cut the power first. Don't let them see our shadows." His voice was low but firm, as if the order had been tested long ago. One SEAL slid aside and approached an old breaker box mounted crookedly on the wall. Elias did not check his watch. He counted by breath. When the switch was pulled down, the lights inside the building snapped off without delay. The darkness thickened instantly, like another door being shut. Two guards stood at the bottom of the stairwell, rifles leaning against the wall, talking loosely about something unrelated. They did not register the change in light. Elias moved in. The distance collapsed in 2 steps. The first man went down, his body falling heavy and dry. The second turned, mouth just opening, and Elias finished it. No shout, only the sound of bodies hitting the floor. Then nothing. Elias signaled to drag the bodies tight against the wall, hiding them from the hallway angle. He led the team down the stairs. The steps were chipped and slick. Each footfall paused for a beat to listen for a response. This space carried sound well. A small noise could be amplified. Elias knew the transmission source was deeper in the cell block, where the walls were thick and damp. He placed his hand on the first iron door and felt a faint vibration from inside. No voices, only compressed breathing. The cell door opened just enough. The smell of old sweat, dried urine, and rusted metal poured out, dense and heavy. Inside, the hostages curled inward by reflex, eyes wide in the dark, arms wrapped around themselves, like animals kept too long in cages. Elias stepped half a pace in, kept low, and raised a finger to his lips. Quiet. Follow me. Look at the ground. His voice was not rushed, not raised. A few understood immediately, nodding, forcing themselves up despite shaking legs. Another collapsed back down, breathing fast. Elias moved to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezed lightly to set a rhythm, then pulled him up. As they turned, the mistake happened. One panicked hostage stepped back too quickly, his foot catching the edge of a metal table. The table tipped, then fell. Metal struck concrete, the sharp clang ricocheting through the narrow space like an alarm bell. Elias turned the instant the sound hit the wall. He needed no confirmation. Everything had been awakened. Footsteps thundered in from two directions, fast and chaotic. Weapons were charged, the sound sharp and cutting. Flashlights snapped on, sweeping straight into the room, slicing through silhouettes. Elias pivoted and fired the first shot to force the return fire back. He did not shoot wildly. He shot to lock angles, to break the other side's rhythm. Move. I'll hold. He spoke loud enough to cut through the echo, clear enough that the team behind would not turn back. The team pulled the hostages into the secondary corridor according to plan. Elias retreated step by step, keeping distance, changing firing angles constantly. His firing rhythm was steady, not rushed, not broken. Rounds struck walls, sparks flared, fragments sprayed, stinging the face. Elias chose narrow angles, forcing the attackers to bunch up, reducing their numerical advantage. A sharp call came from behind. This way. Elias nodded, fired one more shot to block pursuit, then turned and followed. The auxiliary stairwell was steep and narrow, the railing broken in places. They slid down, gripping what remained. Heads kept low. One hostage slipped, nearly fell. Elias caught him in time and pushed him into the middle of the formation. Shouts echoed from above, mixed with bullets striking steps. Flashlights flickered like blades, sweeping close to their backs. Elias held the rear, returning fire in measured beats, never letting rounds drift. They burst into the rear yard, wind slamming into their faces, carrying dust and the smell of fuel. Gunfire thinned as the formation spread out according to plan. A vehicle waited farther off, engine idling low, lights off. Elias backed up a few more steps, locked the angle one last time, then turned and ran. At that moment, something small fell to the ground, clattering, a sharp, misplaced sound amid the chaos. Elias stopped on reflex, ingrained deep. He bent and picked it up. In the flickering light from a distance, the ID card was unmistakable. Hard plastic, worn edges. The name is printed boldly, unblurred. Anna Voss. Elias held the card for one more beat, long enough to feel the weight of the name, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was tied to a chain of decisions he had just witnessed elsewhere. In another room, at another time, ahead, urgent calls pressed him forward. Elias straightened, fastened his watch, and lifted his eyes from the card as the distant gunfire faded, leaving behind a suspended moment, where a question began to form but was not yet allowed to surface. The message hostage secured was broadcast through the Joint Command Center in a flat voice, no emphasis, no emotion. The sound traveled through the internal speaker system, passing over rows of control consoles, sliding past the ears of officers standing or sitting motionless at their stations. The confirmation text appeared on the main screen, white against a dark background, clear and complete, like every other mission end notice. This time, no one stood up, no chairs shifted. There was no familiar reflexive applause, the kind that had surfaced almost unconsciously whenever an operation closed according to procedure. A young officer swallowed hard, glanced sideways, then looked back at the screen. Someone else let out a quiet breath, then stopped immediately, as if afraid the sound might be heard. The room, accustomed to the urgent rhythm of war, sank into a thick, heavy silence that was hard to name. Everyone understood that this outcome was not like the others. It was technically correct, but wrong on too many levels beneath the surface. Anna was moved through the medical corridor shortly afterward. She did not cry, and did not ask questions. Her eyes were open but did not settle on any particular face, as if part of her awareness was still trapped in another dark room. A nurse checked the bandages, adjusted the IV line, and then stated briefly that her vitals were stable. The sentence was repeated twice, enough to be entered into the record. It brought no relief. It merely marked a necessary pause so the system could continue operating. The medical room door closed. Outside, the command center remained brightly lit. Secondary screens showed archived data, layered digital maps, and signal paths already annotated. Everything was orderly, precise, except for the sensation suspended in the chest of everyone present. Harlan Voss stood near the central table, both hands resting on its edge, as if to keep his balance. He did not look at anyone else. His gaze was fixed on the screen in front of him, where red signals had once appeared and then vanished. Signals he had ordered were ignored. Now they were nothing more than stored data, inert, incapable of interference. But Voss knew that silence was the thing that caused the most serious damage. He heard footsteps behind him, slow and distinct. When he turned, he saw Elias standing at the edge of the room. Elias did not look like someone who had just completed a major operation. Dust still clung to his clothes, his wrist bare, the old watch out of sync as always. He stood straight, neither at attention nor relaxed, a middle posture of someone long used to holding himself upright alone. Voss stepped forward. No one signaled. The distance between them closed in short, careful steps. When Voss spoke, his voice was hoarse from the first word, as if his throat had held too much through the long night. "You saved the people I chose to silence." The sentence fell out, not with the cadence of a speech, but like a piece of truth pulled from hiding. He paused for a beat, then continued more slowly, each word dropping with weight. "I stayed silent to protect my position, and almost lost my daughter." This time, he did not look at Elias when he finished. His gaze drifted aside, toward nothing but unfeeling equipment. Elias looked straight at him. There was no visible anger on his face, and no sign of easy sympathy. He answered at once, his voice even and low. "You didn't stay silent because of procedure. You stayed silent because you were afraid." The words were not raised, not sharpened for pressure. They sounded like a conclusion reached after all other explanations had been removed. Voss stood still. In that moment, the insignia on his shoulders felt strangely lighter, as if it had just lost its protective function. He lowered his head slightly, not to apologize, but like a reflex, when realizing that some gazes had passed through every layer he had built. No one in the room intervened. No one tried to soften the exchange. The room held that silence, as if it were the final, necessary part of the conversation. Elias turned away first. He did not wait for a response. He walked out of the command center while procedures continued behind him. Other officers returned to their screens, their reports, their required wording. The system kept running, exactly as it always had. The next morning, sunlight fell on the small village with a dry peace, direct brightness that neither favored nor punished. Elias's repair shop opened as usual. The metal door made a soft sound as it rolled up. The smell of old oil and hot metal drifted out, mixing with the familiar dusty air. Elias sat at the wooden table, dismantled a radio, and laid out each component in the order only he remembered. His hands still trembled slightly, but the rhythm was different. It was no longer sharp like sleepless nights. It was slower, steadier, like an aftershock settling. A man stood at the doorway, hesitating for a long time before stepping in. He placed a radio on the table, avoiding eye contact. His voice was lower than normal. "Can you fix this for me?" Elias nodded and pulled the radio toward him, asking nothing, commenting nothing. This silence was different from the silence in the command center. It did not hide or suppress. It simply did not need words. A second person came after that, then a third. They brought old radios, devices long neglected. Their eyes avoided his, but the old contempt was gone. Elias worked quietly, as if things were slowly settling into a different order, slower, but more real. By noon, when sunlight fell straight onto the tin roof, Elias removed his watch and set it on the table. The minute hand was still a few beats slow compared to real time. He turned the crown very slowly, one small notch at a time, until the hands met. A soft click sounded, clean and precise. In that moment, his hand went still, not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time in a long while, he felt aligned with time itself. In the afternoon, the wind passed through the village, carrying fine sand against the windows. Elias closed the shop and sat alone. He turned on the radio he had just repaired and adjusted the frequency by habit. Background static filled the room, familiar and steady. He listened without hurry. Within the layers of noise, a short code broke through. It was not a SEAL signal. Elias stood still, listened for one more beat, then picked up the handset, his voice calm and clear. "Go ahead."